mercies are holding me. So no matter the need and no matter the threat, I'm secure in your love. No fear, no regret. Can there be a sweeter comfort, a grace more divine than
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a soul like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Through many dangers
Good evening, and welcome to this online Christian Science lecture. On behalf of First Church of Christ Zionist Pasadena and First Church of Christ Zionist Arcadia, California, we are so glad you could join us. Our lecturer, Brian Pennix, is a Christian Science practitioner and teacher, and he is a member of the Christian Science Board of Lectureship. Brian joins us this evening from his home in Northern California. At the conclusion of our lecture, Brian will remain online with us for a short time to answer some of your questions. You may submit your questions in writing, either during or after the lecture, using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties, you may also use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to help you. We ask that you do not use the raise the hand feature at this time. And now let's give Brian a warm virtual welcome. Brian, you may begin.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you. And hello to everyone online here. This is kind of a special way to do a lecture. First, I just want to thank the First Church Pasadena and First Church of Christ Zionist Arcadia for co-sponsoring this talk for what sounds like a great deal of the Southern California audience. As Scott said, I'm a Christian Science practitioner, and that means what I do is pray with individuals who are looking for healing. And this prayer tracks really closely the teachings of Christ Jesus about how it is that God actually takes care of us. For a number of years, I was a lawyer. And I don't know, maybe it started in the law practice, maybe it came before that. Maybe there was some vague guilt that I was carrying around, possibly my own, maybe something I picked up from others along the way. But the notion of innocence as a redeeming fact of how God creates us has always seemed real to me. I was raised in church, but to tell you the truth, my personal history was kind of all over the map. But over the years, this idea of a God-given innocence that never gets taken away seemed to follow me. I never forgot it, and I believe it blessed my life. I hope you won't think it's too much for me to say. I actually believe it helped bring all of us together today. So thanks for tuning in to this Zoom talk about innocence. I'd like to start with a simple, direct statement, and that's this. Regardless of personal history, every one of you is innocent and safe through and through. And my hope is that by the end of this hour, you just might agree. You know, innocence may seem like kind of a simple thing, but it can also seem, not so simple. And I say that because if you were to search the word innocence on the internet, Google the word, all sorts of visual images would pop up on your computer screen. Some are what you'd expect, babies and bunnies and sweetness and joy. But surprisingly, mixed in there also can be some twisted and disturbing pictures of, victimization, condemnation, kind of the opposite of innocence. One really sweet image I saw was an artist's rendering of Jesus. In this rendering, he was standing and leaning over slightly. And with the most affectionate eyes, he was deeply valuing a man who was disabled. And this kind of tracks what we'll be talking about today. Not babies and bunnies so much, although I have to admit babies will come up a little later, but We're going to look more at those other things that seem, well, mixed into our lives, that say innocence is gone, or who cares? It's not important. Or worse, maybe it's even dangerous. But we'll also talk about how, right in the middle of all of that, we can discover a Christ-like sense of innocence, one that has a powerful healing and protecting impact in anyone's life. And I'll be offering some examples showing how this innocence that actually makes a difference isn't just for some folks, but really it's for everyone all the time. So here's one of those examples. A number of years ago, I was a freshman at a community college up here in Northern California. To tell you the truth, I wasn't at all happy to be there. I'd been accepted to a fine university, but couldn't attend because, well, our family just didn't have enough money. Now, I should say there's nothing wrong with a community college, and to tell you the truth, this one did me a lot of good, but at the time, I was feeling unfairly deprived of something I thought I deserved. And honestly, that wasn't my only complaint, not by a long shot. Lots of things had been going wrong. There were ongoing effects from physical neglect and abuse suffered as a child. And for this, I was carrying around a whole bunch of distrust and resentment. Then my dear girlfriend suddenly broke up with me. Heartbroken. I missed her terribly, but you know, I also began to wonder what was wrong with me that things had gotten so bad. About this time, I'd been doing some long distance running as a form of exercise. At home one afternoon, I suddenly felt, well, unusual sensations in my hands and arms, and then kind of a numbness. And then a sense of pressure in my chest and upper abdomen. And this intensified, and, well, it became pretty frightening. One of the required courses in that community college was a health course. And I remembered a sobering lecture about heart attacks. And I recognized some symptoms the health instructor had described. A family member telephoned a Christian Science practitioner to pray for me. As I said before, a Christian Science practitioner is a person who prays for healing along the Bible-based, Christ-like view we're talking about this evening. I'd already experienced some healing through prayer in Christian Science, and that's why this call was made. I'll talk more about how this prayer works as we go along, but for the moment, what mattered was that the practitioner started praying for me. I don't mind admitting I was scared. I even recall saying urgently, we should call for an ambulance. But then immediately, a very natural feeling of calm swept over me. I still remember that exact moment. It was as if there were a warm, almost glowing atmosphere of love and peace all around me. I felt nothing but love. This love seemed directed right at me. But interestingly, at the same time, it seemed to spread out from within me toward everyone I knew. This love washed away the fear. It washed away the resentment. It washed away the heartbreak. And those things vanished They vanished as if really they had never been part of me in the first place. At that moment, I felt I could safely love anyone. The symptoms disappeared and I felt normal. In that moment, I hope you don't mind if I say in that holy moment, I turned to the family member I so resented and I said, I love you. You know, I can't honestly say our relationship was suddenly transformed at that time. But at that moment, I felt a genuine love born out of this new conviction that I could safely love anyone. As to my lost girlfriend, well, she stayed lost, but you know, I soon began to focus more on the helpful, more kindly things I could do for others instead of worrying so much about what she probably thought was wrong with me. 2 years later, I did go on to the university, and after that, I served in the Army. There, they determined that my heart functioned normally, and there's never been a return of those symptoms. Even now, I still give thanks for that life-changing and healing moment. Thinking back, it gave me a new first-hand sense that there is a God of love, called love, who's actually knowable and not way off in the distance, but instead right here with us. You know, I felt God's love was mine without having to be earned. It was unconditional. It felt as if it was coming to me no matter what I did. In a word, I felt innocent of all those negative things that defined my life at that time, including the way my body was functioning in that acute moment. You know, in the broadest sense, this is what I've seen Christian Science do in my life and really in the lives of many others. It helps people understand what the Bible means about God's love. And it helps them prove practical what Jesus taught about how it is that God cares for us. You know, the way Christian Science and its textbook, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, and incidentally, she's the one that actually founded this approach to Christianity. The way they explain these things is the basis for everything we're talking about today. You know, to some, God is a good and intelligent power or being that takes care of us and protects us from harm. But to so many others, God seems capable of both good and bad, maybe even the source of calamities. You may have heard of folks refer to natural disasters as acts of God. And then there are many who say there's no God at all. Well, to better grasp the love that made me feel so innocent and healed, and then maybe to ground that love, to base it in a clearer sense of God, let's think a little bit about who God is. You know, for a lot of people, the Holy Bible is a doorway to learning more about God. But for others, the Bible may seem suspect or unconvincing. There's little doubt, though, that in the past, and really nowadays, great numbers of people turn to the Bible for comfort and inspiration. You know, until we started socially distancing, I saw this even in public places like coffee shops. And I don't doubt it's still going on wherever people shelter. You could think of the example of a man named John Newton. He lived in the 1700s. One of the most moving Christian hymns ever written is his Amazing Grace, the last song that was played just before this talk started. He had been a profane, slave trading ship captain who changed his ways when he felt that God had saved him from a violent storm at sea. You know, he believed his being saved was God's message to him of his true inner worth. He began to study the Bible. Later, he even became ordained in the Church of England. And actually, it was there that he wrote the words of Amazing Grace to commemorate his feeling of salvation and forgiveness for the horrible wrongs of his past. My own experience showed me that, as it says in the Bible, God is powerful love itself. I don't mean that in some abstract, coldly intellectual sense of the word, nor in some naively hopeful sense of the word, but really rather in the tangible, real sense I felt as I was healed. The Bible also describes God as truth itself, describes God as the all-knowing Father. You know, it even tells us of God as a mothering love. Another clue to God's nature comes in the Bible's first story in the book of Genesis, where it said, God creates us in God's own image. You know, this means we actually bear the characteristics of God. It's not that any of us is God, far from it, but rather we're made to show forth godly qualities like, well, wisdom, kindness, courage, innocence, and power. Power to help ourselves and others. But you know, I realize not everyone sees things this way. In fact, we in this electronic online meeting, we ourselves may well be thinking of ourselves as, well, just physical, vulnerable to crime or epidemics, likely, or maybe even pre-programmed to do the wrong thing most of the time. You know, honestly, aren't we all tempted to see ourselves and others this way? If we think of God at all, we might reverse the more inspiring views of God and instead think of God as having negative human traits, you know, like changeableness, temper, a willingness to allow or maybe even to cause suffering. This reversed viewpoint of God is as old as human history. But the Bible says also that God is of purer eyes than to see evil. I think this brings us back to innocence and its effect in our lives. So let's talk about innocence. What is it? You know, I'd guess that anyone who feels the burden of self-condemnation or who's suffering the accusations of others would love to feel innocent. To others, though, as I suggested earlier, innocence may seem irrelevant, or worse, it might suggest weakness, something that maybe should be avoided as dangerous. Let me ask you, do you ever think how lovely it would be just to go back once again to a simpler, more innocent time? like maybe 2 or 3 months ago. Well, while longing for the past probably isn't all that useful, I think there is one way of looking back that is helpful. The one place where we can see innocence in a way that every one of us can agree on is in the life of a newborn baby. Really, is there anything more innocent, more sinless than a newborn? Take a moment right now, just picture for yourself that newborn. Picture it. Picture some of the features of its surroundings. It's a sweet scene, isn't it? I'm thinking of 3 features. First and foremost, there's mother love. That's the unconditional love that every infant deserves. Does the baby need to do anything to earn that love? Of course not. It just comes naturally. The second feature that I'm thinking of is complete or absolute dependency. The baby can't do anything on its own. It completely relies on others. And the third feature is, well, a genuine anticipation of good. I once read that a newborn still feels so connected, so identified, so at one with its mother, that at least at the very outset, it has no fear that all its needs will not be naturally provided. So for the moment, maybe we can agree that a life that's innocent like a newborn's includes these 3 features. First, an environment of unconditional love. Second, complete dependency. And third, an undoubting expectation of good. Well, what do you suppose happens to these aspects of child innocence? Not surprisingly, as the child matures, dependency on others gradually diminishes. Disappointments may begin to reduce any expectation of always getting everything we need. And a feeling of unconditional love, well, it seems gradually replaced with a sense of love that feels earned or more conditional. And these developments may actually seem to us like a good thing. I mean, don't we want a youngster to be competent and self-reliant? Don't we want her to learn to deal well with disappointments? And don't we want children to learn to respect relationships and to gain the affection and closeness of others? But from the viewpoint of God's nature, as Jesus explained it, there's a way that even as our lives normally develop, it can be without the loss of what I'm going to call real innocence. Actually, I'm hoping that this evening we can begin to redefine, maybe even rehabilitate the word innocence. I'd say innocence, properly viewed as God-given, goes way beyond that short-lived, fragile innocence of infancy. And instead, this real innocence, it sticks around and it powerfully improves lives, as I feel it did in my own case. I think we'd all agree Jesus lived this innocence that's only hinted at in the infant's experience. And he proved how powerful and lasting this innocence is. In the Bible, it's recorded that Jesus healed the sick, including with horribly contagious leprosy, some of those folks. And he radically transformed people's lives for the better. Even those who question this healing record have to admit something. They have to admit at the very least that this man had a remarkably significant impact on what? The next 20 centuries of human experience. The Bible also indicates that throughout his life on earth, Jesus was innocent. So, if we're looking to Jesus as a model of innocence that accomplishes powerful things, it might make sense to consider a few things he said. And I happen to have 3 of his sayings in mind, and they're from the Bible. I'm not going to read them. I'm just going to paraphrase them, and they may sound familiar to some of you. The first one is this. Jesus said along these lines, he said, the Father loves the Son and shows him everything he's doing. The second one is, he said, I can't do anything on my own but what God does. And then the third one, he also said, it's God's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Well, do these 3 sayings remind us of anything? Don't you think they dovetail kind of nicely with the 3 features of newborn innocence we were just talking about? Let's say, if you think of unconditional love, Jesus knew God's unlimited love for him and for us all. That's why he said, God loves us and shows us everything he's doing. As to dependency, Jesus openly said he was wholly dependent on God for his very life. And as to expectation, he knew God would meet all his, indeed all people's needs, that he would give them the kingdom. But you know what we don't see in the life of Jesus is, well, naivete, weakness, or ineffectiveness. And that's worth considering, because these are the negative characteristics that people often associate with the word innocence, at least in adults. But in Jesus' case, the unconditional love, the complete dependency, and the expectation of abundant good related to his, well, really, our heavenly parent, God. And these things were key to the divine power that made his earthly experience so remarkable. They enabled the influence of his career to outlast and transform empires. He outwitted and evaded enemies. You know, even the aggressive acts of injustice and violence that led to his crucifixion left him ultimately unharmed when he rose from the grave. These triumphs were made possible by an innocence that, well, really always lives within each of us. And more than that, this innocence is actually where we live. It's a home we can never lose. What does all this mean? I'd say it means right now we're directly connected to God's unconditional love and approval. We don't have to earn our value in the world. It's always ours. It always has been. It means it's safe to depend on God to guide our steps and to protect us from harm, as promised in the Bible. And it assures us that God provides all our needs, regardless of how much money we might have in the bank. So instead of longing for goodness and simplicity that, well, may seem lost in the past, let's instead look for that innocence that Jesus lived, where the power of Christ reveals our innocence and safety. Actually, this power of Christ extended way beyond the earthly life of Jesus. You could look at Christ as the divine authority God gave Jesus to heal the sick and take away the world's sins. And this same Christ is God's message to each of us today, confirming that Genesis view that regardless of any appearance to the contrary, we're actually made in God's image to be healthy, innocent, safe. I saw something of this years ago in an experience with my little daughter. She was about 4 or 5 years old at the time, and it had become obvious to her mother and me that she had a mild hearing impairment. About that time, I had learned more about prayer as it's explained in Christian Science. And I prayed to see better for myself at first, that God gives each of us only what is good, including hearing. I prayed to see something of my little girl's innocence, her dependence on God, and God's unconditional love for her and really for us all. I began to see how it is that God holds all his children free of any impairment. I expected healing because I was beginning to see the connection between understanding God's care for us and the freeing effect this understanding has in our current lives. Sticking to this truth about her innocence, I realized her God-given capacity to hear, as made in God's image, had always remained acute. There was a warm spring morning, and my little girl and I were sitting out in the backyard, and suddenly she called out, "Daddy, did you hear that birdie?" Well, sure enough, there was a bird chirping way off in the forest that backed up to our yard. She wouldn't have heard that distant chirping before. I answered, "Yes, sweetie, I heard it." And that was the end of the hearing problem. The ideas that led to her healing came right out of the Bible. In the Bible, it's recorded that Jesus said, "Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of heaven," well, the kingdom of God. Referring to this statement of Jesus, Mary Baker Eddy wrote in Science and Health that we can unite with what Jesus established only as we are newborn of spirit. Well, I wonder, how many of us think the things of God or spirit are, well, remote, theoretical, maybe a bit ghostly? What Mrs. Eddy felt Jesus' whole life proved was that the things of spirit or God are actually tangible and immediately effective. She said this view healed her. She had spent much of the first half of her life in 19th century New England chronically ill, and at one point she suffered a potentially fatal injury. But she discovered what we're talking about now, that God made everything that was really made to be permanently good and right and healthy, and that a clearer view of how God made us has a healing impact. And she was healed of those chronic illnesses and that injury. She found out that Jesus' healing abilities were really the natural result of God's active love, a love that actually is operating right now in all our lives. It wasn't just a special thing that Jesus and a few lucky followers enjoyed. She had long studied the Holy Bible and especially Jesus' life in her own search for health and healing. She had also looked into various forms of medical and so-called mind remedies. Eventually, she came to see a correlation between a person's thinking and health. Actually, medical practitioners today acknowledge this same correlation, at least to some limited extent. But in her case, there was a great leap in understanding. And it was this, that bodily organic flesh is actually the least influential thing in health outcomes. Indeed, she came to see that thought alone governs health, including the body, and that inspired godly thoughts, in other words, views uplifted by God, produce good health outcomes. How did she get to this view that, well, still so contradicts conventional wisdom? She learned what it is God is always showing us, that God creates us in God's own image, not some other way around where God seems to be patterned after mortal man. From this, she realized we're not really just fleshly or mortal. What do we suppose the word mortal means? Well, here's a thought. Headed for death. Mortality would, if it could, box us in and say we're inherently flawed, that we're vulnerable to crime or to a lurking disease, and, well, that we're headed in a bad direction. But as Mrs. Eddy's understanding grew that life is actually in and of spirit or God, and not fleshly or mortal, the notion of flesh and physical nature as the framework of life began to impress her less and less. Now I'm not saying fleshly problems and viewpoints disappear for anyone in an instant. But here's what does happen. This Christly understanding of who we are and how we're made puts fleshly appearances into perspective, leaving them with less power to alarm us or to harm us. Why? Because we begin to see that physical observations and appearances are not necessarily the final reality we think they are. Mary Baker Eddy healed many individuals, proving what more Christly views can accomplish. What's more, she showed through her book, Science and Health, how any of us can prove this for ourselves. And you know, that's what's been happening for about 150 years now. Science and Health has 100 pages dedicated at the end of the book to testimonies of significant physical healings that people experienced as they simply read the book. Here's her explanation of how Jesus healed. It's just 2 sentences, and I'm going to read them right out of her book, Science and Health. She wrote, Jesus beheld in science the perfect man who appeared to him where sinning mortal man appears to mortals. In this perfect man, the Savior saw God's own likeness. And this correct view of man healed the sick. This correct view, this Christly view, You know, it not only heals the sick, but it also corrects the wrongs that people do or suffer. And this shows how innocence, rather than being quietly submissive to crime and hatred, is actually an effective counterforce for good. Not long ago, I learned about a young man in wartime. He had been confined to a forced labor camp because he resisted his country's political regime. During this confinement, he was severely whipped, leaving scars on his back that were medically predicted to last his whole life. Years later, he was living in another country, and he and his wife were looking to adopt a baby girl. And in order to do this in that jurisdiction, a psychological examination was required. After the exam, the psychologist remarked how free the man seemed to be of bad mental effects of his brutal wartime experience. But you know, in fact, there did remain some mental scars, and the man prayed to be free of them. These included ongoing nightmares and also, well, daytime fantasies of what he might do if he could ever get his hands on those tormentors. His understanding of Christian Science shaped his prayers, though. And those prayers showed him that God creates all of us to see and know ourselves and others only as God made us. He realized that if he wanted to see himself in that way, that is, unmarked and free, it would be inconsistent to see others in some lesser way. You know, once he came to this logical conclusion, yes, he said that forgiving the guards was relatively easy because he realized they'd only been acting out roles that blinded them to their real God-given natures. Those mental scars, the nightmares and the fantasies left him permanently. Then there was a more challenging question. Could he love those individuals? And you know, he found he could when he felt God's powerful love. I'm tempted to say it's the same love I felt in that room back in college. When he felt that love replace his resentment with the reality of his and his tormentors' innocence. I don't know. Maybe he also realized that he could safely love anyone. Well, not long after this, he realized that the scars, the physical scars on his back, were gone. Seeing the innocence of even those who had hurt him and loving those individuals, he realized were the same thing. It lifted him above all forms of scarring and led to his physical healing. How could this be? The Christly view so lifted him that I think he saw a bit of that early Genesis concept that despite any appearance to the contrary, he and those tormentors had always been and still were just as good as God had made them. Thinking from this new standpoint, this man went on to practice Christian healing on behalf of others, and he traveled extensively, telling of this experience for a number of years. You know, another take on the word innocence is that at its root, it means the absence of any harmful or noxious element. This means that through Christ, we can not only be free of accusation or self-condemnation, but really also free of other things we fear, like viruses. God doesn't leave us defenseless. Even while many are waiting for a vaccine, we can learn that Christly innocence inoculates us all right now with God's unconditional love, with confident dependence on God's care, and with safety right inside the kingdom of God. You know, God's inoculation forbids all harm. That's an immunity we don't have to wait for. Similarly, we can dare to know that the wrongs that may actually have been part of our own past never really penetrated or attached themselves to who we really are. This means we're not really miserable sinners after all. Personal history doesn't have the last word. We are right now, and always have been, from the Christly point of view, innocent of all harm, innocent of ever having caused it, innocent of ever being its victim. Why? Well, because Christ is here, showing that we've never become separated from God. The real us has always been dependent on God and safely sheltered, housed in God's love. Mary Baker Eddy lived this same confident dependence on God, undoubting expectation of God's provision, and unconditional love. These qualities of transforming innocence empowered her in what was then a man's world, where women had few rights and were generally told they couldn't do the majority of things she did in the last 40 plus years of her life. Like, well, she made groundbreaking discoveries in theology. I'd say she made groundbreaking discoveries in medicine. She wrote and published extensively. She preached publicly. And she established a worldwide church based on the reinstitution of Christ healing. And this same transforming innocence also kept her safe when she was attacked really relentlessly and publicly for her prominent role in simply advancing this simple, new, yet old view of who we really are in God's image. Let me ask, do you suppose it's possible that this innocence that saves victims might also help, well, the victimizers of the world? The Bible tells us of Saul, later known as Paul, who persecuted the followers of Jesus, but who, according to the Bible, was transformed by Christ to become one of the greatest proponents of Jesus' teachings. John Newton, the profane slave trader who wrote Amazing Grace, worked with William Wilberforce to help bring about an end to African slavery in England. In 1993, in Minnesota, Mary Johnson's only son was murdered by 16-year-old O'Shea Israel. Filled with hate, all she wanted was for him to be punished as a murderer, and he went to prison. 10 years later, the pastor of her church asked her if she would head up a church class on the subject of forgiveness. And in preparing for this, she realized she needed to visit O'Shea and try to forgive him. I can only imagine, still filled with anguish, she went to see him in prison. And you know, they each found a way to talk openly of their lives. She felt a sudden release of the bitterness and the resentment that had consumed her for those 10 plus years. This led her to establish an organization dedicated to healing and reconciliation between the families of murder victims and their murderers. A few years later, when O'Shea was released from prison, she helped him rejoin society. And together, they spoke publicly on how to embrace the freedom that offering forgiveness produces. All this hints at what Christ is doing right now as the light of God's love shines through individual lives. The powerful characteristics of innocence that were at the heart of the life of Jesus are always to be found somewhere in the mix in these other lives. What do you suppose it is that keeps you and me from accepting our own innocence or the innocence of others? Mrs. Eddy uses a term, mortal mind, to explain how it is that bad things happen. In the Bible, Paul used a similar term, the carnal mind. Both of these terms hint at the mental origin of evil. Bad things tempt us. Tempt us as what? As undeniable reality. This assertion of undeniable evil masquerades as our thinking. I want to say that again. This assertion of undeniable evil masquerades as our own thinking. It does this so successfully that we tend to think too often that it really is our thinking. We might even defend it as our own thinking. And then it says, using the familiarity of our own inner voice, it says things like, I'm no good, or I'm a victim, or what if I become sick, or I don't deserve healing. Well, do these things really come to us as words? Not so much, really. They usually come in the form of discouragement or fear. The fact is, though, these presentations, kind of like fictional stage plays we feel forced to sit in the theater and watch, are not the truth about anyone. These presentations are lies. And to counter these lies, the most important thing to understand, to remember, is that in the whole universe, there is only one infinitely good God, infinitely good God. And in that exact same place, there's God's perfect creation, including you and me, still made in God's image. The word mind with a capital M is another name for God. This mind, or God, harmonizes everything that's really going on. Because this mind, being God, is, well, it's all powerful and it's present everywhere. Being present everywhere, this leaves no room for another mind. And it means a supposed mortal or carnal mind, that is a masquerading mentality that's headed for death, is really just tricking us to believe that we or others aren't really made in God's image, innocent and immune. I should say here that this emphasis on the mental origin of bad things really shouldn't be taken to mean that lurking somewhere within our own thinking, there must be some evil that we've got to ferret out before healing can come. You know, the same Christ that shows us we are God's offspring is really better able than we are to erase mistakes from thinking. Our best course is humbly to side with the Bible-based truth that God made us to be like him, and then to let God's Christ sort out the rest of it. This means the godly removing of evil isn't a matter of human will. You can't force it with brain power. It only happens through finding ourselves made in God's own image. And that brings us back again to prayer, the prayer that shows us who we really are. You know, we might tend to think prayer is asking God to bless us in some way. And, well, you know, opening up expectantly to God can be a really helpful first step. But if this turns into feeling like we're bargaining or negotiating with a man-like, changeable God, you know, that's not so useful. The prayer that works is anything that helps us see and feel how infinitely loving, knowable, present, and powerful God really is, and then to see how we're made in that God's image. It's a matter of tuning in to God's message that he's holding each woman, man, child safe, innocent, immune right now. By the way, nothing about Christian prayer departs from the golden rule. You know, doing to others as we'd have them do to us. We love our neighbors, and we only want to comfort them. It's okay to be patient with public misconceptions of religious practice. It's wise to be careful that our own quiet insistence on God-given immunity doesn't frighten others who think safety lies only in medical practice. And it's natural to follow legal directives and guidelines regarding quarantines or social distancing or mask wearing. You know, along with our neighbors, we're all in this together. And we can learn and know that all God's sons and daughters share God's own native immunity from harm. This kind of praying is something each of us can do. We can learn from the Bible and from the explanations in the Christian Science textbook, Science and Health, more about God, more about who we really are as God's daughter and son, and more about how prayer works. Let me suggest that if we're going to pray, let's try to feel our own natural, inborn innocence and immunity in light of God's all-encompassing love. But while we're doing this, let's also remember what this means for the rest of God's sons and daughters. You know, those other folks out there we're sometimes not so sure about. Well, what it means is this: all of God's sons and daughters are like God, innocent and safe. Well, I'm going to close now with this one thought. Innocence is a central fact of how God empowers and immunizes us. Jesus lived this powerful innocence, and he showed us we can do the same. The Christian science that explains this, and really how any of us can prove it, is here to use right now. Well, that's the end of my remarks. I think Scott, are you going to come in with